Greetings. So today is the 15th of March on the Gregorian calendar, and for that reason, I wanted to share some very brief but perhaps still interesting notes of trivia on the Ides of March. And perhaps I should warn you up front that this video is going to be a bit wild with its suggestions at times, and, which I share partly out of academic interest and partly just because it's fun. So if you wish to continue, perhaps you should buckle up, though also feel free to bring a skeptical eye and a skeptical ear with you. Now, I want to begin by first noting that before the calendrical reforms under Julius Caesar, the Roman calendar was lunar, or more specifically lunar solar, like the Hebrew calendar. The first month of that calendar was March, something you can also infer if you treat December as the 10th month, which is actually alluded to in its name, and then count backwards from December to March. You know, if you treat December as the 10th month, count backwards, you'll wind up with March as the first month. And on the old Roman calendar, the Idus, what we call the Ides in English, fell in the middle of the month, at the month's full moon. And so with that in mind, I'd like to read a small excerpt from page 43 of Howard Hayes Scullard's Festivals and Ceremonies of the Roman Republic, which describes this, stating the following, quote, "The Ides were the days of the full moon. They were sacred to Jupiter, and the Flamindialis led a sheep, ovis idulis, along the Via Sacra to the Arcs, and there sacrificed it to Jupiter. The day was said to be called the Trust of Jupiter, Jovis Fiducia, because light did not fail with the setting of the sun, but was prolonged by the moon." End quote. There are a few things worth pointing out here. Note first that the Flamindialis was the priest at the temple of Jupiter. And when we refer to the sacrificing of a sheep around the time of the full moon of the first month of a lunar calendar, which began in the spring, we honestly seem to be describing something similar to the biblical Passover. And yet here we are describing the Ides of March, the Roman Idus Marti, the Roman Ides of March. And regarding that word, Jovis, that was one of the ways to refer to Jupiter in Latin. This might come off as a crazy thought, but you are invited to imagine at least the remote possibility that as Adonis is to the Hebrew word Adon, so too perhaps Jovis is to the Tetragrammaton. And while this is admittedly a cheap point, you might at least find it fun to note that Jovis in the ablative case is Yahweh. And while we're on this track, while this segue might take us farther away from the topic, one more fun bit of trivia is that the vocative form of Adonis is Adoni. The vocative case is when you're addressing the individual directly, like declaring, "Oh, Adonis." When doing so in Latin, you would say Adoni. I don't know about you, but I find that interesting. Anyway, getting back on track with the name Jupiter, the latter two syllables, the part that's pronounced Peter, those latter two syllables relate to the word for father, right? So to recap, we have a feast in the middle of the first lunar month in the spring in which a sheep is sacrificed to a deity with a name mildly similar to the Tetragrammaton who also bore the title father. I don't know about you, but that strikes me as interesting. Now, the Ides of March is, of course, most well known for the date when Julius Caesar was assassinated, when he was stabbed to death. And with that in mind, here's another fun but perhaps crazy thought. Julius Caesar was assassinated in the year 44 BC, his calendrical reform, when Rome switched from a lunar calendar to a solar calendar, went into effect the year before, in 45 BC. So the easy assumption is that Julius Caesar was killed on the 15th of March according to the solar calendar. But as this came so close to the calendrical switch, it came on the heels of the switch from a lunar calendar to a solar calendar, what if it might have happened during the Ides of March, which was still according to the lunar calendar? What if some were still holding to that older tradition? Now, Plutarch tells the famous story of a seer allegedly predicting calamity for Caesar on the Ides of March. And while, of course, we can take that story with a grain of salt, it is nonetheless worth asking if, for the sake of argument, we were to entertain the possibility that the prediction had actually been made, how far back might that prediction have been made? And if it was made before the calendrical reform, could it have referred to the lunar Ides of March? The point here is that while it's perhaps a long shot, it is nonetheless at least possible that the dating of Caesar's murder to the Ides of March may have still been according to the old Roman lunar calendar, Ides of March. And if that was in fact the case, then the betrayal and murder of Julius Caesar happened right around the time of Passover. Like I said, it might be a remote long shot, but it's at least an interesting possibility, and a fun one. Now, there are a few other fun elements in Plutarch's account, like, for example, Caesar reclining at a table at a supper the night before, or his wife having a troubling dream and, recounting such to him. By the way, it also, and you can see this on the page there, it also explicitly refers to the light of the moon, as if perhaps the moon were particularly bright that night. That too might loan itself to a loose interpretation that this happened around the full moon. Ironically, however, even if Caesar was killed on the March 15th of the solar calendar, in March of 44 BC, the full moon still fell on the 15th, right? That's interesting and ironic. However, so, even if it was on the solar calendar, it was still a full moon. However, in that case, if we assume the Passover always fell after the spring equinox, then, the solar March 15th that year would entail that Caesar was killed at Perrin instead of Passover. C'est la vie. Oh, and here's one more fun bit of seemingly random trivia. In the Peshitta, the ancient Syrian Aramaic translation of the Bible, in Mark 15:6 and other verses, but focusing here on Mark 15:6, the feast referred to there, presumably the Passover, is called Ida, literally the feast. Now, there's apparently no connection between the Latin idus and the Semitic, Hebrew, Aramaic, and Arabic word Eid, which means feast, but the mildly coincidental pronunciations seemed worth sharing and noting. Anyway, switching gears, before I close this video, I'd like to segue to another topic, another bit of seemingly random trivia. You see, historically, many in the Roman Catholic Church long celebrated the 15th of March as the feast of Longinus, who, according to tradition, was the Roman soldier who stabbed Jesus with the spear. Now, according to ancient tradition, Longinus later converted to Christianity and ultimately was canonized as a saint. Thinking about this together with the piercing of Julius Caesar, one might feel tempted to compare Longinus to Brutus, and say that while Julius was stabbed by a former friend who became an enemy, the conversion of Longinus implies that Jesus was stabbed by an enemy who, in a sense, became a friend, and so too a servant. But, of course, Brutus could instead be compared to Judas, and if we do that, we could say that both Julius Caesar and Jesus Christ were betrayed by close friends. That aside, interestingly enough, Brutus had a brother named Gaius Cassius Longinus, who also took part in the assassination of Julius Caesar. Ergo, it could be said that both Julius Caesar and Jesus Christ were pierced by men named Longinus. But, alas, you are free to take those traditions with a grain of salt, or perhaps even a fistful of salt, right? You're free to be skeptical. However, I still thought it would be fun to note these things. And, having noted all that, I'll close this playful video here. I hope you at least found it fun and perhaps even thought-provoking. And I hope you had and have an interesting Ides of March. As always, I look forward to the comments of others. God bless.
Caesar, your servant. But I saw you die.
The king is dead. Long live the king!